Hey everybody, Espira here, and we're jumping back with some Shadowverse Evolve content. Previously, we had covered what kind of classes you should look into, as well as what the different keywords in the game do. Now we're going to jump into meta, specifically what decks people are playing, what have done well. I will say the one benefit that this game has in regards to the fact that it is played in Japan before it is played out here in the West is the fact that we have an idea of what we can expect the format to look like and thus get ready for, but there's going to be some differences over out in Japan. They get things like collabs that we're not going to get. Some certain sets are going to be rolled out that we don't get access to, which means our card pool is going to be different. So while we do have a general idea of what everything's going to look like, we don't exactly know what the specific meta will go to, especially since we have the opportunity to optimize the meta. Whereas Japan does get to create the meta and at least initialize what it's all going to look like, we have the opportunity out here in the West to be able to finalize that and really bring it together. So with that said, let's just jump into what exactly was played in set 1 and then kind of get a better idea of the different decks that you should be expecting as you jump into the first set format. Kicking it off, I want to make sure we go over a bit of the class hierarchy in terms of what you should expect a certain class's power level to be. And to be honest, for set 1, it's not too complicated. The class to beat is definitely Dragon. Dragoncraft is incredibly powerful because it just has so many good tools in that mid-range to late game to have great burst damage, to have good longevity, to have early defense. That just kind of lends itself to being the deck that can kind of deal with everything. Shenlong, which is the only card I believe to be in the Japanese ban limited list, currently being limited at 1 copy, just goes to show how powerful the class is. But thankfully, every other class is viable. It doesn't matter. They all have a build that's able to play incredibly well. The deck to beat is definitely still Dragons. It's definitely the boogeyman of the format, I say, or at least kind of the gatekeeper. But nevertheless, there are builds in every other craft that can see legitimate play to a point where you can go into a game expecting to try to creep out a win. Are some matchups going to be more difficult than others? Absolutely. But it is great to know that no matter what, you have the chance to be able to take your deck into a game and expect to come out hopefully with a win. So if we step away from the classes and actually look into like the specific meta, and this means specific builds, specific decks, what are everything doing? At the moment, we're breaking it down to tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3/rogue. So tier 1 being defining what's the best of the best, what are the decks to beat, tier 2 being decks that can put up good results, but could probably do with a couple of optimizations or don't necessarily have everything they need to consistently be able to stay at the tier 1 or do not have consistent matchups against every other deck in the tier 1. And then finally, tier 3 rogue. Generally, it's tough to say. I think these are decks that don't have enough data. I grouped them all together because tier 3 decks could probably be grouped like the same as rogues, just based off the fact that we don't have a bunch of tournament data. And I will say a lot of this is based off of data we've been able to pull from, and I'm actually going to reference where we got it from in a minute. But I do wanted to note that because of the product shortage in Japan, set 1 didn't actually have premier level play. It had locals level play, and this is kind of where a lot of this scrounge up data I've been able to find on the internet is. But it's not some specific as having like premier events that we're able to pull top cut stuff from. That actually comes with set 2. So that's when we actually get a better defined meta. This is very much just the scraps and pieces we're able to find from locals. So with that said, Dragon is the boogeyman. So Ramp Dragon is definitely the tier 1 deck of the format. You'll be able to go into any matchup and have a reliable game plan with it. However, there is also aggro banner for Swordcraft, utilizing the banner card to be able to give an anthem effect to your entire board, which gives everything +1/+1. Very powerful, allows you to have kind of like similar style burst damage that Ramp does. But of course, because you're an aggro deck, it means sometimes you can just get there because being the aggro deck, you always have the opportunity to get under the go big decks before they have a chance to be able to stabilize or see the cards that they need. Aggro banner definitely has some excellent cards in its toolkit to be able to kind of push that aggro. In tier 2 now, again, playable. Doesn't always stack up against the tier 1s as good, but will still have a solid chance. Kicking it off, we have D-Shift OTK. This is a 1-turn kill style deck where you set up Dimension Shift, which will allow you to take an extra turn and then be able to crush out your opponent with your current board or using some burn magic or anything in between. From there, we have Earthright. So actually, Rune has 2 solid builds in terms of being able to go either way, whether you really dig into this OTK style build or whether you go for the more mid-range Earthright build. They both lend themselves to be able to have a great game plan, which means generally no matter how you go with Runecraft, you'll always probably have a certain level of a build that has the competency because you have things like good card draw and you have good consistency pieces that allow you to do things every single game a lot more reliably than other decks, which lends itself to mean that both style of decks you can play with Runecraft right now both lend themselves to having a good chance of winning. From there, you have Abysscraft aggro, just good lean bodies that are able to do a lot of damage. You have a couple of cards that are able to rip cards out of your opponent's hand. Of course, there are the cards that have good stats but cost you like your own life, but you don't care as long as your opponent's slowly losing their own life themselves. So it'll do its thing. It's a really solid color that has some really like fun pieces that lend itself to Abysscraft aggro actually being a viable strategy for multiple metas, not simply the first set meta. Then we have Roach OTK. You are utilizing the fact that you can play a lot of cards on your own turn to then get a massive storm body to be able to ram into your opponent. Very much leaning into the Forcecraft notion of just playing a lot of cards, setting up a way to be able to play a ton of cards. Lots of fun on that side. From there, we have Amulet Control. So you're utilizing a bunch of Amulet cards to be able to accrue advantage, as well as being able to do things like using board wipes, but because your amulets aren't specifically followers, you're able to kind of make it like a one-sided board wipe. A lot of really cool control options there in terms of going back and forth, but because you're using amulets, oftentimes what ends up being symmetrical effects don't end up being all that symmetrical. Then we have the tier 3 rogue category. These are fun ideas. These are interesting deck styles, but things that don't either have the consistency or the power ceiling to be able to get there, or the current card pool doesn't allow you to fully express yourself with these archetypes. So to kick us off, we do have Reanimate Control. In Abysscraft, the ability to be able to use stuff out of our cemetery is a ton of fun and tends to actually be a little bit broken depending on what we have access to. But at the moment, the card pool doesn't lend itself to it being the most insane thing we're able to do. We don't get the cheat out curve that badly, but nevertheless is definitely a strategy you can dole out. Then we have Forcecraft Midrange. Stereotypical as it gets. You have some good early game pieces, you have some good late game pieces, and you're just trying to do your typical strategy of trying to grind out a game until you can push out a win. Not much to say there. Whether you have aggro or control, you've got mid-range in the middle that will kind of do a little bit of everything. From there, you have the Roost Dragon deck. So Roost is a card that allows everything to be like half cost. It's kind of janky though. It's super neat, but it's super jank in the notion that your opponent gets to get the benefits of the effect first, which means you're basically telling your opponent, hey, you get to use your hand for completely reduced, and then when it comes back to me, I'll be able to do so. Now, the idea here is that your deck is full of much bigger bodies, so you can utilize the cheapening effect more. But unfortunately, in a world of like tempo and stuff like that, it just lends itself to kind of being a little too janky. So it's 100% a rogue strategy. Then we've got Flaming Glass, one of my personal favorites. Essentially, you're utilizing flame and glass cards in your deck to be able to set them up in your cemetery, so that then when you actually play out Flaming Glass, you get a burn ability, you get additional stuff depending on where those cards are. And the fact is that this archetype is actually neutral, which means it's splashable in any type of deck. So I think it can lend itself to so many fun shells, whether you go Abysscraft or Dragoncraft or anything in between. It's a ton of fun for me. It's definitely a rogue strategy. It doesn't have the ceiling that it necessarily needs, especially for the amount of work you need to get the combo off. But regardless, this is an archetype I can see myself picking up and just having a ton of fun and just try to figure out where the best shell for it is. And then finally, just like we have Forcecraft midrange, we also have Swordcraft midrange if you want to get your aggro banner stuff, but add in a couple of like go big pieces so that you can contest yourself better in those go big matchups. You can definitely lend yourself there and do that. From this meta breakdown, I actually do want us to go over one deck from each class so you have an idea of where they stand. So we'll be looking at the tier 1 and tier 2 decks and at least pulling one from each, which for our case here means we're only going to be seeing one Runecraft deck, but at least we'll be covering the spectrum. And this is where I want to give my shout outs to, first off, Shadowverse. So Shadowverse, I believe, is a Singaporean local who's been running tournaments from set 1 onwards and actually has a website where he goes over the different metas and stuff like this. And this is where a lot of data was initially pulled from. So thanks to them, of course. And Cosmic Plays, you guys already know, a good friend of the channel, has been doing his own content as well and has actually been sharing out English versions of deck lists that you guys can go and run. So we'll actually be running through those specific deck lists for this video. Kicking it off, first we do have Ramp Dragon, and this just does the thing that Dragon typically does. It wants to get into its late game plays, and then it wants to drop bomb after bomb after bomb. The two key pieces for this strategy primarily are Forte. She's the 7 damage burst that has aura, which means your opponent's not going to be able to deal with it. Just know that anytime you're at 7, you are at Forte range, which what makes this deck so incredibly powerful. Alongside that, if you want to aggro down this deck, which is typically what you want to do, right? Ramp decks take a minute to get up. If they don't see the exact cards that they need, they stumble, their hand is unplayable, then you can aggro and punish them. But Shenlong is actually so good in the fact that it actually will heal you by 5. It has ward, which means it's effectively almost healing you for 11 when you consider the 6 that it takes before you can go and get hit again. So it's an incredibly powerful card that actually is the only card currently on the Japanese banned and limited list. Would you believe it? Which is actually nuts, but very exciting there. And again, if you want to look at the deck list, I highly recommend you just go back and scrape it from there. But the general idea being that these two things are what really kind of brings the strategy together. Moving on from that, we have Aggro Banner. This is the strategy that utilizes the banner card to be able to give an anthem effect to your entire board to give them +1/+1. And then the strategy will also make great use of Tsubaki to be able to close out the game. This strategy is incredibly low to the ground with kind of similar burst potential as Dragon. So it kind of makes sense, right? Very similar to Dragon. Storming out a lot of burst damage can be incredibly good. Tsubaki here having a little bit more of flexibility in the fact that she can also remove a follower, which is really great. And then you combo that with Royal Banner, which means that your little bodies are getting there for a lot more damage, which means it's not as hard to be able to burst down your opponent. Incredibly solid and consistent strategy. Moving on from the tier 1 into the tier 2. We are going to see D-Shift OTK. And this strategy utilizes the fact that you can dump a bunch of spells into your cemetery and then use Dimension Shift, which will give you an extra turn for the cost of 7. So that's basically what this card deck does. And for that, you'll utilize Merlin. And Merlin is actually a huge pickup for the game. So if you guys want to play Runecraft, I highly recommend you guys go and pick up your Merlins because she will be incredibly good even into the 4th or 5th set, I think, that Japan is in right now. So the whole strategy will be digging for your deck, looking for the things that you specifically need. When you evolve Merlin, you're able to use a spell from your cemetery for free. That's like cost 3 or less, which will allow you to dump more. And basically, you're just trying to fill up a board that you can get 2 turns with, being able to deal damage. And then there are some bigger cards that are able to help with the burst as well. So really, really fun deck. I love these type of OTK strategies. I love taking extra turns. This deck is something that I am definitely all about. Moving on from there, we have Amulet Control. This is a deck that utilizes amulets and the fact that you can kind of create asymmetrical board states with your opponent to take max advantage of that. And then there are naturally cards that lend themselves to when amulets are destroyed, they're going to deal damage to your opponent or so on and so forth. Things like that. So in a couple examples here, we got Holy Sentinel. Once on each of your turns, when another amulet leaves the field, summon a Holy Tiger token and give it ward. So you're consistently getting bodies on the fact that your amulets are coming in and out. And obviously you have other synergistic pieces in your deck that allow you to be able to do that. And then the control aspect is really the fact that you're able to make sure your opponent doesn't have anything on board while you're able to keep on chipping damage away from them. The example here being Themis' Decree, destroy each follower on the field. So it's just a clean board wipe. However, remember, it's specifically follower, which means if you have amulets on the board set up that you can pop your opponent's board, and then you can start popping your own amulet and then keep your followers on the board. So it's this great like managing your removal and your amulets to make sure you can get the max value out of them. Then from there, we have Aggro Abyss, and this is literally just turn cards sideways. That's all this deck does. Look at the amount of 1 costs it uses. Anything that's able to get some damage on a board before your opponent's able to deal with it is exactly what this deck is trying to do. Some of example cards here, we have Ambling Wraith, which fanfare deal 1 damage to each leader, and then it's a 2/1, which means it can come down, it'll swing on its second turn, you're dealing 3 damage, which is pretty relevant. Just more things like that. And then Crazy Executioner is actually so good. Unevolved, deal 2 damage to your leader. You don't particularly mind because since you are the aggro deck, your opponent's trying to stop you from attacking into them as much as they are attacking you, which means they play more defensive cards, which means you don't actually care about your own life total as much. Then select an opponent. They reveal their hand, select a card in their hand. The opponent discards that card. This is so incredibly powerful. The ability to be able to, 1, get perfect knowledge of your opponent's hand. Huge, because then it allows you to understand what kind of situation you're in terms of trying to race your opponent. And then secondarily, getting rid of the best card in their hand for the current situation, and then hoping they just can't draw into another one. So good. Crazy Executioner is actually nuts, and this strategy lends itself to being incredibly consistent and really like a solid pick that doesn't cost that much, if I recall. Then we have Roach OTK, the entire strategy lending itself to, it's not the only thing you're trying to do. You're not only trying to win with Roach, but nevertheless, you're trying to set up a way in which you can have lots of different plays, either by loading up your EX area with a bunch of pixies and then casting them to then OTK with Roach. And like the namesake of the deck, the whole deck revolves around Rhino Roach and being able to get in with his evolved body for Storm. Every time you play a card this turn, fanfare, it'll get +X+X. So you can get your opponent down 2, 6, 7, however much health, and then able to burst it down. And that's where cards like Rose Queen come in, where you get to select any number of fixed followers in your EX area and transform them into Thorn Burst tokens. Thorn Burst, spell, verdant. Select an enemy leader or an enemy follower on the field, deal 3 damage to it, and draw a card. So you can use multiple of these, and then Rhino only costs 2, and then his evolve cost is 0, meaning that you can use 8 spells cost of stuff, and then be able to go from there. Now, I will say Thornbursts do cost 2, which means you don't get maximum value, but there are definitely ways you can sling these spells together to be able to get the absolute maximum value from your Rhino and be able to OTK your opponent. And with that, that is the general gist of the meta. Of course, we didn't go over every single deck, but I definitely do want to see myself going into Ruse, going into Flaming Glass, maybe going into Reanimate Control. So there are aspects of other decks that I think will get their own dedicated. And of course, we didn't go into deep into the different choices of the decks, but I just wanted to make sure that, hey, this is the meta. This is kind of like what we're going to look into going into the first set and kind of give you an idea of what decks look like. And then as we optimize them, as we understand them better, as we see tournaments with results, we'll be able to go more deep into them. So this isn't the Holy Scripture. This isn't written in stone. These are kind of just the notions we've had from the data we've been able to pull from elsewhere. And again, thank you so much to Shadowverse and Cosmic for putting the data together and then for me to be able to present with you guys. So with that said, this is generally what I believe set one's going to look like, but I could be very much wrong. So I would love if you guys could tell me in the comments down below, one, where you're going to be playing, but two, kind of what your thoughts are on the meta, and maybe are things going to look a little bit different now that we have the game here in the West? I would love to know. And with that said, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Ciao.